Hello, I am Bernadette Slowey. You can call me Bernie. Like many of you, I wear many hats. I am an entrepreneur, a writer, a former bank executive, mother, wife, and filmmaker. The timing of this happens to coincide with the 10-year anniversary of my first film project that actually chronicles my on-screen transformation. I'll get to that, but first I'll start where my story began. I was born in Saigon during the Vietnam War. My mother fell in love with an American GI, and their love story was similar to the well-known musical Miss Saigon. I have a vivid memory for when I had just turned 4 years old. I was playing with kids in a courtyard one day when a 2-year-old little girl suddenly disappeared. She had been abducted, and I was blamed for it. Not by my mother, but by my aunt, who was supposed to be watching us that day. My mother told me that it was my cousin, but we would never speak of her, and we would never speak about what happened that day. Years later, I would learn that that little girl lost was not my cousin, but in fact, my younger sister. My father had already returned to the United States when my mother and I evacuated just days before the fall of Saigon. We reunited with my father safely, but growing up in Nebraska post-war was not easy for me or my parents. We experienced prejudice, and my mother and I had our fair share of racial slurs and bullying. My father decided we would move away to Iran, where he would reunite with some of his war buddies and other expats to work at Bell Helicopter. I was 7 at the time when the anti-Shah revolution began, and we had to evacuate once again. We returned to Nebraska, but this time, with the hostage crisis making the nightly news, people assumed that my mother and I were terrorists. I was not yet 8 years old and had already evacuated from 2 war-torn countries. Life outside our home wasn't easy as a result, and because of my parents' tumultuous relationship that started during a war, it wasn't easy growing up inside our home. My parents had more children together, and so I was the oldest of 4. Growing up, I never understood why my mother often took her anger out on me. Also, she would leave me and my siblings with our dad for months at a time. I tried really hard to be a perfect daughter, but I just wanted the love of both my parents. It created a deep need to achieve and be accepted. The external validation would become the measurement of my worth. In 1984, my parents were together again, and that was the year we moved to Colorado. It was like hitting a reset button for me. My life changed for the better in so many ways. I was making friends, my ethnicity wasn't an issue, and I felt like I was achieving in school. Immediately after graduating high school, I moved out, got a job as a teller, worked full-time to put myself through college as a full-time student. Even after I graduated college, I remained in the financial industry for 20 years. The banking profession had been very good to me up until my final year. It was 2009 during the financial crisis in the middle of the Great Recession when my new boss was hired. It was already a stressful time in the banking industry, but my new boss managed not to only create a toxic work environment, he thought his harassing behavior was okay. The stress was overwhelming. I had 3 miscarriages within 6 months after he was hired. My body was telling me it was time to go. I felt like my soul was dying. It was the 20th anniversary of my banking career when I resigned, unceremoniously. Leaving the banking industry felt like a divorce. Leaving my career, title, and a steady paycheck felt like a death. I left without a golden parachute or any kind of severance. For my well-being, I just needed to leave the nightmare that once was my American dream. My identity had been wrapped up in the achievement of successfully climbing the corporate ladder, and dang it, that external validation would still be the measurement of my worth. I had spiraled into an identity crisis and was looking to do something with more meaning. I thought I could take my professional skills and apply to a job in a nonprofit sector. However, because of the Great Recession, it was highly competitive with many nonprofits closing at the time. There were a lot of experienced executive directors vying for fewer positions, and even though if I was the finalist, the job would still be offered to somebody else. As an overachieving perfectionist who always got the job I wanted, the rejections were a blow to my ego. It was a very difficult and humbling period. I took a personal retreat to Sedona so that I could begin to heal. Heal from the miscarriages, the loss of the career, the job rejections, just so I could rebuild my identity. It was during that trip that I had an idea for a TV show about transformation travel. But I was a former bank executive. Who was going to even take me seriously? And how was I going to break into the television industry with no filming or production experience? Hey, I know what I'll do. I'll transfer my project management skills and produce a documentary. I loved movies as a kid, and I learned English actually watching movies. And it was like an escape for me to get away from my home life. I knew that others had had their own difficult transitions during that time as well, so I thought focusing on a topic, merging science with spirituality, would be timely. Out of the blue, I was called by a spiritual teacher I had met soon after my first miscarriage. We had been out of touch, but he wanted to invite me to a spiritual conference in India. It was completely illogical and unconventional, and with only 5 weeks to put a production calendar together, but I did it, and I found a film crew and booked my flight. Everything seemed to be falling into place until I arrived in India. The conference wasn't what I expected, and the tour afterward was mysteriously canceled. My project was falling apart. Thankfully, a new tour schedule was created so that I would figure that I would just interview the speakers and how they started on their spiritual path. We were heading to the Taj Mahal when we made a pit stop. I had asked my cameraman to shoot some monkeys and a snake charmer with his cobra. This was for B-roll. From a distance, I saw the cobra begin to strike the camera. It triggered something inside me, and I became visibly upset. Thankfully, I was surrounded by spiritual teachers. One of them attempted to console me and asked a series of questions like, "What are you afraid of? Are you afraid it's going to bite you? Are you afraid of dying?" In that moment of utter fear, I had absolute clarity. It wasn't that I was afraid of dying. I was afraid that I hadn't fully lived before I died. My cameraman fortunately captured the entire moment, which I fondly refer to now as my Cobra moment. Watching the B-roll footage later that evening with my co-producer, I saw the cobra through a totally different lens. The cobra wasn't striking to attack. It was actually trying to get away. I watched as the snake charmer pulled the cobra back into its basket. And the fear that I once felt suddenly turned into compassion. The cobra wasn't free and fierce. It was being caged in a basket. I was in tears after realizing that the cobra was just a mirror, that I felt caged and I wanted to be free. My co-producer turned to me and said, "I don't think this movie is supposed to be about the spiritual teachers. I think this is about your journey." The movie did indeed transition into my story, and the whole experience changed me forever. Editing the movie was very profound. I had to separate myself from the story. Shooting the movie was one thing. Editing to tell the story was another. My perfectionist side didn't want to be seen as vulnerable. What would people think of me? But all the hours scripting and then editing and then re-scripting to rehash my story over and over was actually very therapeutic. My story no longer owned me. I was owning my story. The movie premiered at a film festival in 2015 to sold-out screenings. Watching the movie with an audience was totally surreal. All those times watching movies as a kid, I'd wished that I was someone else. And here I was, the protagonist, that I was the star of the movie. I'd set out to make a documentary about other people sharing their story because I never thought that my story was worthy enough to share. Once the movie premiered, I went on a trajectory that I never expected. I was having a blast speaking at film festivals and meeting so many amazing people along the way. The movie paved a path for TED Talk, becoming a published author, And then I created a retreat business so that other women could experience their own transformational journey. And now I know that the external validation is not a measurement of my worth. True wealth begins from within, and self-worth is what drives net worth. I truly believe that when we live authentically, synchronicity seems to happen. Remember my sister who was lost in Saigon, never to be seen again? In 2018, I received a call about a cousin who was contacted after doing a family tree DNA test. A woman emailed him asking if he was related to anyone who may have served during the Vietnam War. She knew her father was an American GI and that she was lost on the streets of Saigon when she was 2 years old. I couldn't wait to speak to her. I knew she was my sister. We confirmed it by matching our DNA tests. 44 years later, we were miraculously reunited. The emotional reunion at the airport with all the siblings was recorded, so we'll remember it forever. Now that story is a different movie for another time. Life really is like a movie. There were 4 major takeaways I have from filmmaking. 1, we choose which lens to see life through. Like when I was able to see the cobra from a different perspective. Are you seeing life happen to you, or is life happening for you? That cobra moment changed everything for me. 2, scripts can be written and edited as necessary. I thought I was a victim of my life with all the trauma from childhood, the toxic boss, the miscarriages, and the identity crisis. But the movie would really be boring if there weren't challenges to overcome. Whether it be trauma or tragedy, we are stronger for it. Just like a caterpillar that goes into a cocoon, it cannot be helped when it breaks out of its shell, or else it won't be strong enough to take flight when it transforms into a butterfly. Are you scripting your life as a victim, or are you the victor? 3, after viewing the footage, writing the script, and editing Bernie's journey, I realized that not only was I the director of the movie, I was the director of my life. As any good director, they know when to take action, but it may be even more important to know when to surrender. So allow your story to unfold in divine timing. And 4, what is the most critical role of a movie? You, the hero. There is no movie without the star, and you are worthy of being the star of your movie.